The cuffs clicked shut with chilling finality, but Daniel Rig didn't flinch. The 66-year-old Marine sniper stood silent and still, his expression unreadable, as if this moment being arrested like a criminal was something he had seen coming all along. To onlookers in the small-town courtroom, he was just another grizzled old vet who'd probably lost his temper at a gas station. No one asked questions. No one cared to look deeper. A few people even chuckled. The prosecutor smirked. One juror rolled her eyes. To them, Daniel was a washed-up soldier who couldn't leave the battlefield behind. But what they didn't see was the man who had once served with unwavering honor, a sniper whose precision had saved lives and altered battles. Today, all they saw was a quiet, aging man in plain clothes who didn't speak in his own defense. No outbursts, no excuses, just silence. That silence, however, wasn't guilt, it was dignity. Daniel didn't need to justify himself to people who had already made up their minds. He had lived long enough to know that sometimes the truth has to walk into a room on its own terms. And though the courtroom saw him as a threat, he knew that real threats don't stand calmly in handcuffs. They don't show up to every hearing on time wearing the same old shirt. They don't carry history in their silence. Daniel Rig wasn't broken. He was burdened by memory, by sacrifice, and now by judgment from a world that no longer remembered what he gave. And yet he stood steady, waiting not for mercy, but for someone, anyone, to finally see the man behind the name. Daniel Rig sat motionless at the defendant's table, his weathered hands resting calmly in his lap. The courtroom buzzed around him, shuffling papers, hushed whispers, and sidelong glances. But Daniel didn't move. His stillness wasn't from fear. It was a kind of defiance, a quiet protest against being judged by a world that had long since forgotten what real sacrifice looked like. To the jury, Daniel was just another old man with a short temper and a forgotten war. The charges were minor, an alleged threat at a gas station, but the room crackled with tension like everyone was waiting for him to explode. He didn't. He hadn't uttered a single word since his arrest. The court-appointed attorney barely knew how to handle him. He won't talk, she had told the judge. He just shows up. The prosecution spun that silence into menace, painting Daniel as a ticking time bomb. No one questioned it. The supposed victim, a 30-something gym regular with a neck brace for dramatic effect, testified that Daniel had muttered something about knowing how to kill from 800 yards. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The phrase military violence was repeated, whispered like a spell meant to conjure fear. The gas station clerk mentioned an aggressive posture. A bystander said Daniel looked like he could snap at any moment. What no one asked, what no one cared to ask, was who Daniel Rig really was. There were no questions about his service, no mention of his years in the U.S. Marine Corps, of the classified operations, of the medals quietly stored in a dusty box under his bed. He lived alone, kept to himself, and walked at dawn every day like clockwork. That made him odd, not honorable in the eyes of those who had never worn a uniform. The judge tried to keep the proceedings moving, her tone polite but brisk. She referred to Daniel only as the defendant. The defense attorney offered a half-hearted objection when the prosecutor described Daniel as unstable and intimidating. Daniel remained still. To him, this wasn't a fight worth raising his voice over. He wasn't afraid of the verdict. He had faced death before in jungles, in deserts, across sniper scopes. This wasn't combat. This was misjudgment. No one in that courtroom saw Daniel Rig as a man. They saw a shadow of who he once was. And worse, they treated him like he didn't matter anymore. But the silence in Daniel's heart wasn't empty, it was full. Full of names he hadn't spoken in decades. Full of moments that couldn't be explained to people who thought danger lived only in movie scripts. He had carried the weight of service with humility, and now he carried the weight of being misread by a society that had no space left for quiet dignity. The jury would soon deliberate based on shallow testimony and unfounded fear. The prosecutor was already practicing his closing statement, sure of a conviction. The defense attorney typed notes she wouldn't use. Daniel's eyes remained forward, fixed on a point in the distance. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was hope. He didn't need the room's sympathy. But a small part of him wondered, would anyone ever understand what it meant to be forgotten by the country you bled for? And just then, while the court waited for a verdict it thought was sealed, something outside the courthouse changed. Just as the courtroom settled into an uneasy stillness, The heavy wooden doors creaked open with unexpected purpose. Heads turned, cameras clicked, but no one was prepared for the man who stepped through. General Samuel Wyatt, retired Chief of Special Operations Command, stood in the doorway, wearing a sharply pressed dress uniform adorned with 4 silver stars. He didn't smile, didn't glance around for recognition. He simply walked steady, direct down the aisle of Courtroom 3 like it belonged to him. The judge blinked, unsure whether to rise. The bailiff instinctively straightened his posture. Even the prosecutor's jaw went slack, his earlier confidence visibly draining. At the defendant's table, Daniel Rig finally lifted his eyes. Their gaze met two warriors whose lives had once intersected on a battlefield far from here. No salute, no handshake, just a moment of quiet understanding between men who had seen hell and returned with stories no courtroom could comprehend. The judge found her voice. "General Wyatt, may I ask the nature of your presence?" Wyatt turned toward her, then to the room, his voice calm but unshakable. "I'm here today because this man sitting before you is the reason I'm alive." The silence that followed was heavier than anything spoken that day. Reporters froze mid-note. Jurors leaned forward. Brenda, the young court reporter, stopped typing altogether. General Wyatt stepped forward. 31 years ago in Fallujah, my team was cut off 2 men down, no communication, trapped behind enemy lines. We were as good as gone. Then a single sniper opened a path. 12 targets, neutralized in under 5 minutes. The final shot, 936 yards, moving target crosswind, saved my life. He turned to face Daniel again. "That sniper was Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Rig," murmurs broke out across the courtroom. Even the previously smug prosecutor lowered his eyes. The jury sat in stunned silence. "I've read the charges. I've seen the so-called evidence. I don't know what words were exchanged in that gas station parking lot." Wyatt continued, "But I do know this: Daniel Rig has never used his past as a weapon. If he said anything, it was out of reflex, not threat. He didn't ask me to come. In fact, knowing him, he probably hoped I wouldn't. But I did, because silence doesn't mean guilt. And sometimes the quietest among us carry the heaviest truths." He turned to the judge. "With your permission, I'd like to address the jury." The judge hesitated only a second before nodding. General Wyatt took a slow step toward the jurors. "This man didn't speak because he's tired not of responsibility, but of being misunderstood. He's tired of watching civilians mistake discipline for danger, silence for hostility. And while you might not see a uniform on him anymore, I do. I see the sacrifice, the years, the battles most can't imagine. He didn't return from war to be praised. He came home to fade quietly. But make no mistake, when chaos strikes and you don't know where to turn, you'd praise someone like him as nearby." The room was breathless. Then Wyatt did something no one expected. He turned back to Daniel and knelt, not out of weakness, not ceremony, but apology. Gasps echoed. The judge's gavel trembled in her hand. Even the court guards averted their eyes, overcome by the weight of that moment. Daniel slowly stood. For the first time all day, he moved with intent. He reached out, steady hand meeting Wyatt's. The two stood together, not as legend and general, but as brothers in arms. The courtroom, once eager to judge, now sat in reverent silence. And the story was no longer about an old man on trial. It was about a forgotten hero finally being seen. The courtroom, moments before restless, fell into a hushed stillness as General Samuel Wyatt, his uniform immaculate, 4 silver stars gleaming, stepped through the doors. The judge paused mid-sentence, the bailiff straightened, and the jury instinctively turned their heads. It was as though the air itself had shifted. At the defense table, Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Rig slowly looked up for the first time that day. His expression didn't change much, but his eyes that had seen more than most, met Wyatt's with something close to understanding. Without ceremony or delay, Wyatt crossed the courtroom, not stopping at the bench or addressing the attorneys. He walked directly to Daniel, the man who once saved his life in Fallujah. There was no salute, no handshake, just the quiet acknowledgement between 2 men bound by the kind of truth only shared in war. The silence between them roared louder than any speech. Turning toward the judge, Wyatt's voice was clear, steady, and full of purpose. "I'm here because this man," he began, gesturing to Daniel, "is the reason I am standing here at all." The courtroom seemed to lean in. He recounted how years ago, pinned down behind enemy lines with 2 men down, and no communication hope had all but disappeared until a single Marine sniper began firing. 12 targets, 5 minutes, each shot saving a life. The final one, a 936-yard rooftop hit through a crosswind. Surgical, impossible, unless you were Daniel Rig. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at Daniel in a new light. Wyatt continued, "Daniel didn't ask me to be here. In fact, I know him well enough to say he'd prefer I hadn't come at all. But when a man like this is being judged for a few words in a parking lot after giving everything for this country, then silence becomes complicity." Then something extraordinary happened. Wyatt stepped forward and without hesitation dropped to one knee before Daniel. He didn't do it for drama or applause. He did it because, in his words, "You don't chain men like this. You honor them." The entire room gasped. Even the judge's hand trembled as she gripped her gavel. Daniel didn't move at first, but then slowly he rose to his feet. For a long moment the 2 men stood eye to eye. Daniel extended a hand. Wyatt took it. And in that handshake, generations of duty, pain, brotherhood, and sacrifice were acknowledged. Not as general and Marine, but as two soldiers who had lived through the unimaginable. The judge, clearing her throat and composing herself, rendered the only decision that now made sense. All charges against Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Rig are hereby dismissed, effective immediately. Cheers were not appropriate, but the silence was louder than any applause. As Daniel walked out of the courtroom, free at last, he wasn't met with cameras or reporters. He was met with rows of veterans outside the courthouse, standing at attention, saluting as he passed. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. For the first time in decades, Daniel Rig felt something return that had been missing for too long: dignity. Not granted by a courtroom, but restored by the truth and by the presence of someone who remembered. When Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Rig walked out of that courtroom, he wasn't just leaving behind four walls and dropped charges. He was walking out from years of silence, misunderstanding, and quiet pain. In that single moment of reverence, when a four-star general knelt before him, Daniel's honor was not just restored, it was recognized by a nation that had forgotten too many like him. It was a reminder that real heroism isn't loud. It doesn't demand applause. Sometimes it's a man who says nothing but has given everything. This story is more than just a courtroom surprise. It's a powerful lesson for all of us. We live in a world quick to judge, quicker to forget. But honor, sacrifice, and service don't end when the uniform comes off. If we don't take time to listen, to see past the wrinkles, in silence, we risk losing the very values that hold our nation together. So here's our question to you. Have you ever known someone like Daniel Rig, a quiet hero who never asked for recognition but truly deserved it? Share their story in the comments below. Let's keep their legacy alive. And if stories like this move you, if you believe that respect must be earned but never denied, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another powerful story that reminds us who we are. Let's make sure silence never buries honor again.